3 months ago, two federal regulators put their names on a document that did something Congress still hasn't managed to do after nearly a year of trying. They formally classified XRP by name as a digital commodity rather than a security, not a rumor, not a leak. A signed joint interpretive release from the SEC and the CFTC. If that already happened back in March, why does every headline this week still talk about XRP's legal status like it's an open question? Why did the Senate just adjourn for an extended recess without anyone treating this as settled? Stick with me because the answer reveals something most coverage of this story keeps getting backwards, including a popular claim about a completely different SEC proposal that people keep confusing with what actually happened in March. Quick disclaimer up front, this isn't financial advice. Nothing here is a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold anything. This is a breakdown of what specific regulators and lawmakers have actually done on the record and where the real gaps still sit. Verify the specifics yourself before acting on anything. If you're new here, this is the deal. I don't take a headline's word for what a regulatory document actually says. I go find the document. This week, untangling the difference between two things people keep treating as the same thing seemed like the most useful thing I could do. So let's get into it. What actually happened in March? On March 17th, 2026, the SEC and CFTC jointly issued a 68-page interpretive release, building on a Project Crypto initiative that Chairman Paul Atkins launched the previous year, and a formal SEC CFTC coordination effort that began in January. The release did something no prior SEC guidance had ever done. It sorted digital assets into 5 categories: digital commodities, digital collectibles, digital tools, stablecoins, and digital securities. Only the last category counts as a security under federal law. The other 4 explicitly do not. Then it named names. 16 specific tokens were identified as examples of digital commodities, including Bitcoin, Ether, Solana, Cardano, and XRP. For XRP specifically, this closed something that had dragged on for years. The SEC had spent half a decade litigating against Ripple over exactly this question, and the agency's own interpretive release now states in writing that XRP is not itself a security. The release also went further than most coverage mentioned, explicitly stating that mining rewards, staking rewards across every common model, airdrops distributed without payment, and the wrapping of a non-security token into a different format are all non-securities activities. That last point matters more than it sounds like it should, and we'll come back to it. So here's the obvious question. If a real federal interpretation already settled XRP's classification in March, why is everyone still treating the Clarity Act vote like the moment that decides everything? Here's the catch, and it's the single most important sentence in this entire video. An interpretive release is not a statute. It binds the SEC and CFTC as agencies today under this leadership, but it is not law passed by Congress and signed by a president. A future SEC chair and a future CFTC chair appointed by a future administration could revise or withdraw the same interpretation without asking anyone's permission. Nothing about the March release requires 60 Senate votes or a presidential signature to undo. The Clarity Act exists specifically to take that same conclusion, XRP and similar assets are commodities, not securities, and weld it into statute where it can't be quietly rewritten the next time the people running these agencies change. The mix-up that's been spreading for weeks. Now, here's where I need to correct something, because a specific SEC proposal has been getting credited with doing something it was never designed to do, and the person best positioned to clear it up has already tried repeatedly in public. You've probably heard people refer to an innovation exemption as some kind of administrative backdoor around Congress. a parallel path that lets the SEC quietly hand the crypto industry what the Clarity Act is supposed to deliver. SEC Commissioner Hester Pierce, who's actually been working on this proposal, has gone out of her way to shut that framing down. Speaking on a podcast in June, she said plainly that the innovation exemption hasn't even been released yet, calling that a myth that needed dispelling. She's also been explicit, going back to a post in May, that whatever does get released will be narrow, limited to tokenized versions of real equity securities, meaning actual shares of actual public companies represented on a blockchain. It does not cover synthetic tokens that merely track a price. And it has nothing to do with classifying assets like XRP, Bitcoin, or Solana as commodities. That question was already answered separately by the March interpretation. This isn't a small mix-up. It means the genuinely consequential administrative action, the one that already happened and already named XRP, has been getting less attention than a proposal that doesn't exist yet, is scoped to a completely different problem, and according to its own author, will not be the sweeping crypto rulebook some people are expecting. If you've seen a video or a post treating the innovation exemption as the thing that resolves XRP's legal status, that claim doesn't hold up against what Pierce herself has said about her own proposal. Why the SEC's own safe harbor for wrapping matters right now. Remember that detail from the March release about wrapping non-security tokens into a different format being treated as a non-securities activity. Here's why that's not just a technical footnote. XRP isn't built on a proof-of-stake network, so there's no native way to stake it for yield, the way you'd stake Ethereum or Solana. Some platforms have been exploring a workaround. Wrap XRP into a synthetic version on a separate proof-of-stake network, so the wrapped version can generate staking rewards while the underlying XRP sits locked in reserve. The obvious worry with that approach has always been securities law. Does building a yield-generating wrapper around an asset turn it into something that needs to be registered? The March interpretation's explicit language on token wrapping gives platforms considering exactly this kind of product a real written basis to argue it doesn't, at least under the current agency's reading of the law. That's a genuinely useful, underreported consequence of the March release, and it's a much more concrete, real-world application than anything the innovation exemption, which again hasn't been released, currently offers. The numbers behind the recess. Everyone's reacting to this week's headlines are about the Senate adjourning for an extended recess running until July 13th. And you're probably seeing people frame that as either devastating or irrelevant, depending on which account you follow. The actual math is more interesting than either extreme. The Clarity Act cleared the Senate Banking Committee on May 14th by a 15-9 vote, with two Democrats, Ruben Gallego and Angela Alsobrooks, crossing over, though both attached public caveats that their committee vote doesn't commit them to final passage. The bill landed on the Senate's legislative calendar on June 1st as calendar number 423, which means it's eligible for a floor vote whenever leadership schedules one. Getting to that floor vote and actually passing it are different problems. Cloture takes 60 votes. Republicans hold roughly 53 seats. That means at least 7 Democrats beyond Gallego and also Brooks need to cross over. And as of this week, that math hasn't been solved. The same 3 blockers that have dogged this bill for months remain open. An ethics provision around senior officials profiting from crypto policy, law enforcement's concerns about a developer liability shield, and reconciling the Senate Banking Committee's text with a separate version that came out of the Agriculture Committee. Here's a genuinely useful media literacy point buried in this story. If you've seen wildly different probability numbers for this bill passing, anywhere from the low 20s to the low 60s, that's not necessarily anyone lying to you. Different trackers are pricing different questions. A number near 22% might be answering, does this pass by August specifically? A number near 48 to 60% might be answering, does this become law sometime in 2026 at all? Those are different bets with different time horizons, and conflating them is how a single story ends up with five contradictory sounding headlines. When you see a percentage attached to this bill, the first thing worth checking isn't whether it's bullish or bearish, it's what exact question that number is actually answering. What isn't ambiguous is the calendar itself. The Senate returns July 13th. The House Financial Services Committee has back-to-back hearings scheduled July 14th, covering new Fed Chair Kevin Warsh's first congressional testimony, and July 17th, focused directly on the Clarity Act, notably held in New York rather than Washington. Stifel's Brian Gardner has said the bill probably needs to clear the Senate by the end of July, ideally sooner, for 2026 passage to stay realistic. After that comes the August recess, which both parties' own members describe as the wall everything has to clear before the calendar starts working against it heading into midterms. Senator Lummis has said missing that window could push the next real opportunity to 2030. That's not a talking point. It's the same senator who helped negotiate this bill describing what she believes the actual cost of failure looks like. The other bill, nobody's watching, and why it matters just as much. While all of that plays out in the Senate, a separate fight has been moving through the House that addresses a different piece of the same underlying problem, and it deserves more attention than it's getting. Right now, if you mine or stake a digital asset, the IRS treats the reward as taxable income the moment you receive it, valued at whatever the market price happens to be that instant. If the asset's price later drops before you sell it, you can end up owing tax on value you never actually realized. Tax professionals call this phantom income, and proof of work and proof of stake networks now secure something like $1.7 trillion in digital assets, according to the trade groups pushing to fix this. Representative Mike Carey introduced H.R. 9175, the Tax Clarity for Mining and Staking Act, to let taxpayers elect to treat newly created tokens like other self-created property, deferring the tax hit until they actually sell. The House Ways and Means Committee held a hearing on it June 9th. Less than 2 weeks ago, on June 21st, the Blockchain Association, the Digital Chamber, and the Crypto Council for Innovation sent a joint letter urging the committee to pass it without changes, specifically pushing back against a Democratic amendment from Representative Stephen Horsford that would cap the deferral at 5 years. The American Bankers Association, for its part, has objected to the bill on different grounds, arguing it gives crypto rewards more favorable tax treatment than bank interest or dividends receive, a fairness argument worth taking seriously even if you think the underlying tax mechanics favor reform. Why mention a tax bill in a video about XRP's legal classification? Because regulatory clarity and tax clarity are two separate locks on the same door. The March interpretation tells you what XRP legally is. The Clarity Act would tell you who regulates it and make that classification permanent. H.R. 9175 would tell you how staking and mining rewards actually get taxed once you're holding or earning these assets. An institution deciding whether to build a real product doesn't need just one of these answered. It needs all three, and right now, only one of them, the classification question, has even a temporary answer, and that answer is sitting on an interpretive release that the next administration could rewrite without a vote. What institutions are actually telling you by their own behavior. If the March interpretation were genuinely sufficient on its own, you'd expect institutions to treat it as the finish line. They haven't. Standard Chartered has tied a specific price target for XRP, $8, explicitly to Full Clarity Act passage and an estimated $10 billion in resulting ETF inflows, not to the March interpretation that already exists. That's an analyst's conditional estimate, not a guarantee and not my own prediction, but the structure of it tells you something important. Even the institutions most bullish on this asset are pricing the statutory outcome differently than the administrative one. They're not betting on March. They're betting on whether Congress finishes the job. That's the honest, slightly uncomfortable answer to the question I opened with. The March interpretation was real, it was significant, and it gave XRP something it had never had before: a written federal statement signed by both relevant regulators that it is not a security. But significant and durable aren't the same word. A future administration's SEC and CFTC could walk back every line of that document without Congress ever weighing in, which is exactly why the people closest to this fight, the same senators negotiating the ethics language, the same lobbying groups running advocacy days on Capitol Hill, the same institutions sizing up ETF flows, are all still treating the Senate floor, not the March release, as the moment that actually locks this in, where this leaves you. So here's the honest summary. Without the comforting flourish most coverage adds at the end. Yes, the infrastructure is being built in parallel across regulatory, administrative, and tax channels at once, and that's a real pattern worth tracking. But the direction is clear and the outcome is locked in are different claims, and the gap between them is precisely the difference between an interpretive release that one election could unwind and a statute that can't be undone by a change in agency leadership alone. The price genuinely might be the wrong thing to stare at this week. The actual wrong thing to do is to mistake March's administrative action for the kind of permanence only Congress can provide. If untangling which regulatory action actually happened and which one is still just a proposal was useful to you, the like button helps this reach people working through the same confusion. And if you want me tracking what happens when the Senate comes back on July 13th, subscribe, because that's when this either starts moving or starts running out of road. Tell me in the comments. Before this video, did you know the March interpretation and the innovation exemption were two completely different things? I'm curious how widespread that mix-up actually is. I'll see you in the next one.